and I'd like to share a bit about the Jews of Europe before the Second World War and the growing clouds of antisemitism. Who are we talking about when we mention the Jews of Europe? We're not just talking about numbers, though there were millions of them. We're talking about an entire civilization, centuries old. We're talking about a unique religious and cultural heritage. We're talking about an equally unique folklore of countless stories of wit and wisdom. And we're talking about two uniquely Jewish languages, Hebrew and Yiddish. We're talking about the old wooden communities called shtetls that dotted the countryside of Eastern Europe, immortalized in the literature of Isaac Bashevis Singer, and later brought to life in the classic Broadway play Fiddler on the Roof. Demographically, there were, by 1800, some 2.25 million Jews in the world. By 1880, that number had ballooned to 7 million. By 1914, there were 13 million Jews in the world. In 1850, 2,350,000 Jews called Russia their home. In general, the 19th century was a time when things were looking up for European Jews. All through Western Europe, Jews at last received full civil rights. In France by 1791, Holland by 1796, Belgium by 1830, Denmark by 1848, Austria and Hungary by 1867, Italy by 1870, Germany by 1871, Switzerland by 1874, Great Britain by 1890. Jews were free to vote, run for office, enter professions, join the army. Yet antisemitism remained the dark background noise of the continent, often given a veneer of pseudo-scientific jargon, Semites versus Aryans. Imagine what one of the many rabbis living in Kyiv, one of Russia's western territories, let's call him Rabbi Yitzhak, might have told us about what was going on in those days.
Я рабин Іцхак із синагоги Бродського в центрі Києва, і я хотів би поділитися кількома речами про єврейське життя в Росії. The Russians didn't know what to do with us Jews. They only knew they didn't want us scattered throughout the land. So they restricted us to a crowded region known as the Pale of Settlement, a vast area stretching from the Black Sea to the Baltic and comprising over 1 million square kilometers. The Orthodox Christian peasants of the region of course lived in misery, and the Russians in general found it easier to blame the exploitation of the peasants on us Jews than on the Catholic noblemen who oppressed them. To make matters worse, Tsar Nicholas I of Russia instituted a system of forced conscription of Jews into the Russian army, this occurring between 1825 and 1855. Young people could be taken into the army from the ages of 12 to 25, and they had to remain in military service for 25 years. Each community was given a quota to be inducted. We would do anything to prevent our young men from being taken. Some would falsify birth records, conceal their children, or maim them so they would fail the army physical exam. These children, some younger than 12, were not likely ever to be seen again. It was a time of horror. In April 1881, an anti-Jewish riot, a pogrom, broke out here in Kiev. There was widespread looting and property damage rather than personal injury or loss of life. But repression became more systematic. Under the temporary regulations of May 1882, the May laws, we Jews could no longer settle in rural villages, even within the Pale. Those of us who left villages for the towns, even briefly, were forbidden to return. Many small towns were classified as villages and closed to Jews. We were forbidden to trade on Sundays and Christian holidays. Quotas were put in place, limiting access to universities and professions. We were confined to the overcrowded cities of the Pale. We were harassed by police, who were charged with enforcing the regulations. From Kiev the riots spread, hitting over 100 Jewish communities. There were deliberate acts of arson, The old Udenstädtel community is being particularly vulnerable. In 1891 the Jews were expelled from Moscow, reaffirming the Pale of Settlement policy. In 1903 a particularly violent pogrom took place in Kishinev.
The location of the pogroms has been meticulously mapped, and the sheer area they impacted is nothing short of staggering.
Pressures increased each year. Press censorship intensified, along with the drumbeat of anti-Semitic propaganda. Yet, the effect of the pogroms was quite the opposite of what was intended. Historically, Jews had lent their support to the secular authorities. Now, for many of us Jews, especially the youth, persecution only intensified resentment against the government.
Meanwhile, back in France, in 1886, a newspaper called La Libre Parole began printing exposés of a Jewish officer, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, who had reportedly passed military secrets to Germany. The charge, of course, treason. Such was the background of the notorious Dreyfus affair, an international scandal that, on a political level, split France in two. It was France's 19th century version of Watergate. In 1894, I was convicted and sent to a penal colony at Devil's Island, off the coast of French Guiana. In my absence, the so-called Dreyfusards sought to expose the serious irregularities of my trial, and the anti-Dreyfusards just as fervently tried to cover them up with nationalistic and anti-Semitic propaganda. Reporting on all of my troubles was the Paris correspondent of Vienna's Neue Freie Presse, the New Free Press, Theodor Herzl. Like most Parisians, he initially assumed that I was guilty. But when he heard cries of "Down with the Jews" in the city streets, he had an epiphany of sorts. He suddenly understood the true precariousness of the Jews' position in the diaspora and concluded that the only answer is a sovereign state for the Jewish people. My case, the so-called Dreyfus affair, embodied more than a miscarriage of justice. It gave voice to the wish of the great majority of the French people to damn one Jew, and through me, all Jews. The crowd yelled, "Death to the Jews," as the stripes were ripped from my uniform. And from then on, "Down with the Jews" became a battle cry. Where? In France. In Republican, modern, civilized France, 100 years after the French Revolution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man. In 1896, Herzl published The Jewish State. That same year, independent investigators and French intelligence officials determined that the real traitor was an infantry officer of Hungarian background, Major Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy. I had been framed. In 1897 and 1898, the first two Zionist congresses took place in Basel. Also in 1898, French novelist Émile Zola published J'accuse, an open letter to the President of France, denouncing the cover-up in my case and exposing the real perpetrators. I was brought back from Devil's Island for a new trial in 1899, but once more I was convicted. New elections in France finally brought a more liberal government to power, and the conviction was at last overturned. The prestige of the military sharply declined, and the forces of reason triumphed, but all too briefly. For France, the worst nightmares were yet to come, even while many Jews were at last escaping Russia for a new life.